I've borrowed this Vector from a viewer here in New Jersey, which is no easy feat because Vector only made about 20 of these during this car's production run from the late 1980s to the early 1990s. Now, despite its rarity, most car enthusiasts know about the Vector, mostly because of its absolutely ridiculous styling, which I truly believe is the most insane styling of any car ever to reach production in the entire history of the car industry. But the insanity of this car's styling is only part of the craziness of this car. The W8 used a 6-liter V8 that was a modified version of the Chevy Corvette's V8 from the time, but then it was twin turbocharged for 625 horsepower and 650 pound-feet of torque. For reference, the Lamborghini Countach of this era was only making about 450 horsepower. Now, interestingly, Vector mated this monster engine to a General Motors 3-speed hydromatic automatic transmission that had also been used in motorhomes and RVs in the 1970s. I'm not kidding. Then there was the company itself. Vector wasn't supposed to be an automotive company, but instead rather an aeromotive company, because founder Jerry Weigert wanted the car to be sort of a fusing of automobile and jet airplane. And I don't just mean that in terms of styling. There's more to it than that. You'll see what I mean in a few minutes. Weigert also wanted Vector to be sort of the American supercar, America's answer to Ferrari and Lamborghini, but Vector always struggled to be a viable company. As an example, the M12, which was built after this, the successor to the W8, used a Lamborghini V12, but Vector had trouble paying Lamborghini for the engines, and so at one point, Vector actually offered one of these to Lamborghini as payment for M12 engines, which Lamborghini accepted. There was also a hostile takeover attempt of Vector from a company in Indonesia, which Jerry Weigert successfully sued to stop from happening. But back to the W8. Now, at the time this car came out, Vector said it would do 0 to 60 in 3.9 seconds, and it could hit a top speed of 240 miles per hour. But magazine tests from the time said 0 to 60 was more like 4.2 seconds, and the top speed was probably around 210 to 220 miles per hour. Now, that's still an incredible figure, and it would have made this the fastest production car in the world at the time it was on sale, but nobody ever tested it. Now, the sticker price when this car was tested by magazines 30 years ago was around $285,000, which translates to about $600,000 in today's money. And yes, Vector only made 20 of these for the entire world, which makes this one of the rarest cars I have ever. Okay, so now I'm inside the Vector W8, and it is time to go over the insanity of this interior, and I want to start with an explanation of why that door sill is so wide. And that's because the gear lever is there. That's right, you have the gear lever between the driver's seat and the driver's door, a feat that I'm not really sure is repeated in too many other cars. Now, you can see it sitting there in park, and like I mentioned, the Vector uses the old 3-speed automatic hydromatic transmission from General Motors, and it's operated in the same way. You have to pull up on the shift lever in order to engage each gear, park, reverse, neutral, drive. You pull up on the lever, you pull back, and you go through them all. That's how you shift this car into gear. Now, truthfully, the owner of this car told me that the transmission is heavily modified from your standard General Motors 3-speed hydromatic, but nonetheless, the fact that it's based on that at all is pretty crazy. Almost as crazy as having the transmission lever between the driver's seat and the driver's door. But the door sill isn't wide only because of the gear lever. That isn't the only thing mounted over there. Another item over there is the mirror controls. Yes, this car has power mirrors, and the controls are mounted again to the left of the driver's seat between the driver's seat and the door sill. Now, the mirrors in this car are absolutely crazy. They're basically stuck onto the lower part of the windows in this aerodynamic shape and they just look insane, especially from inside the car, but you can see pretty well out of them. And if you want to move them, you use this control, and yes, they still work. You can move around the power mirrors in a Vector using this little control next to your seat. It goes up, down, just like power mirrors in any other car. It's just a slightly different placement for them. Now, another contributing factor in that wide door sill is the power window switches, which are also mounted between the driver's door and the driver's seat. Now, the power window switches look like standard General Motors power window switches, but they control some truly insane windows. Take a look at these windows. The way this works apparently is if you press the button to open the power window, then this little middle piece in the window actually automatically retracts backwards in order to open up. It doesn't go down, it pulls backwards. Now, the reason I'm not demonstrating this for you, this is the one thing the owner of the car told me not to touch. He said everything else is fair game, but he's very worried that these might break, and obviously no replacement crazy middle Vector power window will ever exist again. Now, if you look closely at these windows, you can see the little seal that goes around the middle power bit that opens, and you can also see this little conduit running to the window that obviously contains the wires that open it up. Now, another interesting item over on the left between the driver's seat and the door, you have the ashtray and the cigarette lighter. You can open that up, and that's how you light your cigarette and where you put your ashes in the Vector. You also have a parking brake over here, but it's not just a regular parking brake, it's a very bizarre one. That's because it looks like a fairly normal parking brake until it curves. In order to conform to the space that it has to fit in, this parking brake is half normal in the boot area, and then half like tilted at a 45-degree angle on the handle area, which is so weird. But that's what they had to do in order to get the parking brake over there. And that's how it works. But by far the craziest thing, between the driver's seat and the driver door, you have these little buttons mounted above the gear selector that say 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, I always wondered, what are those gears, but it only has a 3-speed, so why are there 4 buttons? I never understood. Well, it turns out they control the screen. Ah, yes, the screen. There is a screen to the left of the steering wheel that apparently was legitimately taken out of a fighter jet. It was the same exact screen used in whatever fighter jet was happening at the time, or at least so says Jerry Weigert, who created Vector. Now, this screen is controlled with these 4 little buttons above the gear lever, and they all pull up a different type of screen. And yes, in this Vector, the screen is still working beautifully. Okay, so let's go through this. Now, you can see along the bottom, it describes what each screen does. And screen number 1, if you press button number 1, that would be the main screen that shows your typical main important items. For instance, over on the left, you have what gear you're currently in, P, R, N, D, L, and yes, this does work in real time. As you move the gear selector, it correspondingly moves on this screen to let you know if you're in park, reverse, neutral, drive. That is really, really impressive to see on an old school screen like this. Now, also on that number 1 screen, or the main screen, it shows you your current fuel level. It also shows you your current speed. And yes, again, this updates in real time. As you drive along, you can see it lets you know what speed you're going and updates how fast you're going. This is the speedometer in the Vector. This is how it works on this number 1 main screen as you drive along. Same deal with RPMs. Again, this updates in real time as you drive along. Accelerate, slow down, your RPMs change, and the change is shown on this screen. Now, this screen also shows a couple of other pieces of information, specifically your current odometer reading and also the current time. Now, you move on to screen number 2 by pressing this little 2 button above the gear lever, and this is the performance screen, and it shows various different car functions. For example, your engine temperature, your oil pressure, and various other different car items you might want to see in a performance setting to kind of let you know how all of your vehicle systems are doing. Now, interestingly, if you press button number 3, that also is a performance screen. It shows a couple of transmission items like transmission temperature. It also shows battery voltage, again, always updated in real time, so you know exactly what's going on with your Vector on that screen. And finally, if you press button number 4, that pulls up a screen that Vector calls your chassis screen. Although that is a fairly optimistic description, because what it actually shows is like this side profile picture of your Vector, and then it lets you know if anything is open, like your engine cover, your cargo area cover, or your door. And yes, again, it updates in real time. You can see if I close the door, then it shows on the screen that the door has been closed. And again, if I open the door, it shows on the screen that the door has been opened, updating the screen in real time. That is just one of the coolest things to see. And next up, speaking of opening things, and specifically opening the door in the Vector, here's how you do it. You reach over to the door panel and there's a little door latch. You pull on that and then kind of push it up and the door will do the rest. And that's how you open the scissor door from the inside of the Vector W8. And next up, time to move on to the rest of the interior and all of the other Vector in-cabin craziness. And I want to start with just sort of a general overview. Like I mentioned before, they called it Vector Aeromotive, and it was trying to sort of resemble a fighter plane and a car at the same time. And so that's why the interior looks like a cockpit. You have buttons styled like an airplane would have. You have that screen that I already showed you. And if you just take a general look around this interior, you will see the aircraft design influence on this interior, especially the aircraft from the 1980s. And that is very true if we start looking at all the buttons and switches. We will start over on the left of everything where you have the light controls. You can see you have controls for the headlights, parking lights, fog lights. All of the headlight controls are over there. Instead of just being on a simple little dial, they each have their own individual button, which I guess helps the aircraft look. You also have a button there marked INT, and that's for interior lights. You press that, and yes, the interior lights still turn on, at least in this Vector, to let you read a map or whatever while you're driving or riding in your Vector. You also have the hazard light switch below that. You can press that, and that will turn on the hazard lights. Now next, moving over to the second row of buttons and dials here, two especially stand out. One says panel, and there's a little dial BRT and dim. That is the panel brightness, and you move that up or down, and it instantly dims or brightens your entire cockpit-like instrument panel in here, and obviously it works pretty well. Now you also have display BRT and dim, and I assume that was a brightness dial for the display screen, but unlike the panel dial, the display dial doesn't seem to be working at all. You move it up or down, nothing happens. The display stays the same level of brightness. Now the buttons that I really like in this row are the cruise control buttons. First, it's impressive that this car has cruise control at all. No other exotic sports cars from this era did, but the Vector was ahead of its time in some impressive ways, and cruise control was one of them. But the buttons are ridiculous. Instead of a very simple little turn signal stalk or steering wheel control, you had 4 square buttons. One said enable, then there was engage down, engage up, and inhibit. Enable would turn it on, inhibit would turn it off, but instead of saying on or off, enable and inhibit, again, I guess to feel like a fighter plane with the language used on those buttons. Now next you move over from that row of buttons and you have the buttons and dials you see below the fighter jet style screen. One of them says HUD, bright, dim, and off, for a heads up display. Only problem is this car didn't have a heads up display. I think Vector was hoping they would add one later, and obviously it never came to fruition, but that dial is in here even though it apparently controls absolutely nothing. Now next to the heads-up display dial, you have a dial labeled boost, and you can see min and max, and you can adjust it. You have adjustable boost from the factory in this car. Now one of the big selling points of the Vector at the time was intended to be the fact that it used a fairly large engine that wasn't very stressed, unlike the Ferrari F40 with its small turbo V8 and various other supercars at the time. And so they actually let you turn up the boost depending on how fast you wanted to go, because the thinking was it probably wouldn't harm this large engine and its internals. That is a pretty impressive thing. You won't see that on too many cars. Now next to the boost dial, you can see there's another little panel of buttons in here. These actually aren't buttons. It turns out these are warning lights. You can see you have low coolant, you have the brake warning light, fan inop, low oil, whatever, to let you know if something is wrong in your Vector motoring experience. Now next to that little panel of warning lights, you have a really unusual one, engine hours. This gauge shows how many hours the engine has been operated. It has an odometer like I showed you in the screen, but it also has an hours gauge like an airplane, again trying to drive home that point that this was an aeromotive company instead of an automotive company. You don't see too many engine hours gauges in cars. Now, next to the engine hours gauge, you have this little panel to the left of the steering wheel that has a bunch of different, what looks like buttons on them. It turns out this is actually like the fuse panel circuits, and if something gets tripped, you're supposed to, I guess, push it, and then that will reset it. So for instance, if the audio circuit gets tripped, you could press audio, that will reset it and get your stereo back working again. I think this may also be sort of derivative of an airplane, very unusual to see in a car, but that is what that was intended to be used for. Now next, moving on from there, we have to cover the steering wheel. There are a few interesting items here. Over to the left, you have two stalks coming off the steering wheel. One is the tilt stalk. You pull that and then you can move the wheel up or down for better comfort. Now the other stalk coming off the steering column, fairly standard. This is your turn signal stalk, and it also controls the windshield wipers. Nothing particularly unusual here, except for the fact that this is just a regular old General Motors stock, again pulled off some regular General Motors vehicle from the 80s and placed on one of the most exclusive supercars ever. Very unusual. Now next we move on to the steering wheel, and I love this steering wheel because it looks like a steering wheel from a bumper car you would see at an amusement park. You have a normal sort of wheel rim, but then in the middle it's padded like you would do at an amusement park to prevent like a 10-year-old from getting injured when they're driving on the bumper cars. I think that is hilarious. Now one interesting thing about this wheel, over in that little bank of warning lights, there is an airbag light. So is there an airbag in this steering wheel? That would be impressive. No other exotic cars had that, and very few any cars had that back in 1990. But this car might have an airbag, might not. Hard to find information about that sort of thing. Maybe they just put that light in there thinking they would have an airbag later. But either way, kind of an unusual steering wheel. Now next up, over to the right of the steering wheel, apparently there used to be a little stalk coming off here for the horn, but I guess that broke off. You also have the ignition, and again, this is a regular General Motors ignition switch from this era. Not surprising given the key, but it's kind of funny to see. To the right of the steering wheel, you also have a compass, which is a little bit unusual, especially to see a compass like this instead of a digital display like modern cars have. But again, this is the airplane thing, once again in this interior, just trying to prove how aircraft focused the Vector was. Now next to the compass you have the stereo, which is actually kind of impressive. Obviously there are a ton of buttons on here, but it's just a regular Sony head unit. The impressive part is it's for a CD changer. Most cars in 1990 didn't have a CD player. This thing had a 10-disc CD changer, and that CD changer was over on the passenger side of the dashboard. You could just load CDs in right there as opposed to going into the trunk like a lot of cars from this era. Now the drawback, of course, was that meant there was no passenger airbag. Instead, you got entertainment and music, which I guess was a trade-off that people were making back when this car came out. Now next up, below the stereo head unit and controls, you can see there's a little area for climate controls. This car has air conditioning in this little panel with buttons, lets you adjust the air conditioning, and I will say it is surprisingly good. It blows cold, it blows well, good air conditioning, especially for an exotic car of this era. Now, if you turn on the air conditioning, it blows through 4 separate climate vents, which are kind of small. There's one on the driver's side A-pillar, there's 2 in the middle next to the climate controls, and then there's another one on the passenger side A-pillar. They're these small little vents, but you can move them around. There's sort of these little circles and position the air wherever you want, and you can change the climate controls using this little climate control panel, and that's how the AC and heat comes out in the Vector. Now, speaking of the climate controls and that climate vent over on the passenger side, let's discuss some of the other interesting occurrences over on the passenger side of the Vector. One is the fact that the passenger had their own ashtray and cigarette lighter. So in this tiny little car, in this tiny little cabin, you had 2 ashtrays and 2 cigarette lighters so that driver and passenger didn't have to share. It was a different time. And next up, let's talk about the seats in this car, which are rather interesting in themselves. First off, they're these fairly well-bolstered seats. I actually find them to be surprisingly comfortable. This was an American supercar built for Americans, rather larger than maybe Italians from the 80s. And that's clear with the seats. They're not too grippy or too small. They're relatively comfortable. Now, the seats have some interesting controls to them. They're mounted in the middle on this panel that for some reason says classic. in cursive. Maybe that was the company that made the seat controls. Either way, it looks very out of place. Oh, do you want to change the seat? Oh, go down to the Classic. And that's how you can do it. Now, this little Classic panel has several different controls, one of which is to turn on the heated seats. This car has heated seats, driver and passenger, which would have been very forward for a 1990 supercar. But this car also has 5 other buttons and switches on this little panel. One of the switches moves the seat back automatically. You press the switch and the seat goes backward and forward depending on how you press. Another one is the lumbar support. Again, you press that little switch and the lumbar will sort of inflate to give you more support, or press it the other direction and it will deflate. And then finally you have these 3 black square buttons. These are unlabeled. Initially I thought it was seat memory, but that is not the case. Instead, if you press them, it does like little things. Maybe it changes the bolsters a little bit or the backrest or something, but it has small effects on the seating position itself. Now, one interesting thing, these seats are manual forward and back. So despite all of these power controls and the fact that they're heated, you still had to pull a lever and throw your weight if you actually wanted to move the seats forward or backward. For some reason, they cheaped out in that one particular area. Now, next up, another interesting item in this interior is the fact there is no center console or center divider between the driver and passenger seat. It's just one sort of open cockpit cabin area. The weirdest thing that results from this is the fact that the driver and passenger share a footwell area. There's only one, and that means the passenger has access to the pedals over on the driver's side. So if the passenger places their foot in the wrong place, they might accidentally hit the accelerator pedal or even the brake if they go far enough. Very, very unusual. You never see that, but that's how it is in the Vector. And another interesting item in the Vector, that would be the seat belts. This car uses General Motors seat belts. Not much of a surprise, but the buckle of General Motors seat belts from this area said GM on it. Vector couldn't have that, so instead they placed this little red square on top of the GM logo. I bet if you peeled that back, it would say GM on this seatbelt, but instead putting that red square there gives it the appearance of a traditional seatbelt eject button. Now, another interesting item in this interior, the fact that there's no center console means that there's no center console storage, but this car does have a glove box, which is surprising for exotic cars of this era. Interestingly, it is fairly large. And 2 other interesting interior items, this time on the ceiling. One is the fact that, as you can see, you have a large glass sunroof here. This is a pop-out sunroof panel. There's no cover for it, so you were just left to kind of roast in the sun if you wanted to drive this. Fortunately, like I mentioned, there is very good air conditioning, but all the Vectors came this way with the pop-out sunroof panel. You also have a regular old interior rear view mirror here, although if you look into it, you can see the visibility not so good. The rear window is really small and you can't see much back there, but you do have a mirror. Now, if you're wondering why visibility to the back was so bad, the answer is because it looks like this. This is the rear end design of this car, and it is truly the craziest thing you will ever see. If you get up behind one of these in traffic, you will really wonder if you're looking at a spaceship that has just landed. You have all of these horizontal lines going across the back of the car like only an 80s car could possibly have. The rear window is completely contained within these top 3 lines, and then you have these horizontal lines on the engine compartment, on the spoiler, and then there's another set of horizontal lines in the very far back over the rear lights. Now, you can see when the car is turned on, this is where the brake lights are located. They're sort of around these little horizontal lines in the back. And when you turn on the turn signals in this car, you can see the brake lights become the turn signals in back. Here's this car with the hazard lights on, and you can clearly see the brake lights have become the rear turn signals. They're not a separate turn signal unit in the back. But this is your general rear overview of the Vector W8 with these unbelievable horizontal lines in back. But before I move on from the back of the Vector, there's a couple of other interesting things I want to mention. One of which is right here. You have this rear grille, and mounted on it is the words twin turbo. Doesn't say Vector, doesn't say W8, just twin turbo, and it isn't centered. It's on a panel in the center, but twin turbo is kind of over off to the side for some unusual reason. Now, below that, you have the reverse lights, these little white lights on either side. They come on, obviously, when the car is in reverse, and those are the reverse lights in the Vector W8. Probably my favorite thing back here, aside from the craziness and the overall styling, is the license plate, which was clearly an afterthought. They had obviously designed this car, and then somebody was like, you know, you gotta put a license plate on here. And they were like, oh, crap. So the license plate is stuck off in the corner over by the exhaust. Just ridiculous to stick it over there, clearly indicating that it was not part of the original design process for this car. Now, next up, moving on to the side of the W8, there are quite a few interesting items worth noting over here. I want to start with opening the stuff back here. There are two latches located in the door jamb on the driver's side. You can see there's one on the top, one on the bottom. There's a little keyhole. You can lock them both if you want. Now, if you pull on the lower of the two latches, that pops open the engine cover. You pull it, and then the cover opens up automatically, which is actually pretty nice because then you don't have to go back there and unlatch anything while it's hot and running if there's some problem. And if you look in here, you can see the engine. Like I mentioned, a General Motors V8 modified to 6 liters and with 2 turbochargers, and you can see how they've stuck it in here. This is a very impressive thing, although not quite as exotic looking as some of the other engines in exotic cars from this era, the Ferrari Testarossa, the Lamborghini Countach, obviously because this wasn't designed by the Italians with some glorious V12. Nonetheless, this isn't a view you get very often, the Vector's 8-cylinder engine. Now, the other latch back here opens up the trunk. There's actually a small cargo area behind the engine compartment. You pull on this latch and that unlatches the cargo area. You open it up and you can see, well, calling it a cargo area is generous. It's very wide and very small, but you can get stuff in there if you want. Like, for instance, 2 baseball bats, maybe 3 golf clubs, a ski. Now, next up, I want to move on to some other interesting items on the side of the Vector. I mentioned earlier that in back, there's no badging except for that twin turbo badge. Interestingly, it's the same deal in front. This car has no badge on its nose to let you know what it is, unlike basically every other car ever. The only real badging on the outside of this car is below the doors. It has this huge badge that says Vector W8 Twin Turbo. It is absolutely massive. I guess it makes up for the fact that there are no other emblems anywhere else on the car. You have one on the driver's side and one over on the passenger side. This is just one of the coolest car badges in the industry. I would love to just take this off and stick it up on my wall. I think that is so cool, and someone should put that back into production. But it is weird for a car that took a long time to get to market, a lot of hard work from the company that made it, that it doesn't have any other badges anywhere else. And next up, moving on to a couple of other interesting things on the side of the car. One is the fuel door, which works in kind of an unusual way. You pull out this little tab and then you twist it to the left to open the fuel door. You can also twist it to the right to close the fuel door, and of course there's a keyhole there so you can lock it and prevent people from stealing fuel out of your Vector. And the most interesting thing to me about the fuel door is the fact that on the bottom it says blank US gallons. And I guess the manufacturer of whatever the fuel door was going on was supposed to write how many US gallons this vehicle could take. Vector, of course, did not do that, so instead it is still blank. Now, the other interesting thing on the outside of this car is the wheels. And they're interesting because this car has wheels on it, and yet here is another set of wheels in the owner's garage. There's a reason for this. When the owner of this car bought it, it had the standard stock original wheels on it, and in back it was a 315 width for a 16-inch wheel. And nobody made that size. The owner of this car got in touch with the original chief engineer from this car from 30 years ago, and that guy made him a new set of wheels, except now 18 inches in size, and then it was possible to find a new tire in order to stick on his Vector. So these are not the original wheels, but they look basically identical in style to the original wheels. They just happen to be 2 inches bigger, so you could fit a modern, rational, normal tire on it. Personally, I just like the fact that the original chief engineer for this car is still around, and if you call him up, he'll make you a new set of Vector wheels, although presumably they aren't cheap. And next up, moving further down the side of the Vector, here you can see a couple more interesting items. One, you can now see the mirrors from the outside, and you can see how they were sort of integrated into the aerodynamics of the car. Often mirrors are sort of stuck on there and they screw with everything, but these almost look like they were intended to be part of the design from day one. And speaking of the window, you can now easily see from this angle just how insane the windows in this car are. You don't just have this cool window that slides open with the power window button, but you can also see the windows curve in the middle. You have a flat plane and then they make a turn and go in a different direction down the door. This is a really, really unusual window design, and I would not want to be responsible for breaking one of these windows because I suspect you will never find a replacement. Now next we move further forward in the Vector, and from this angle you can see one of its very craziest details. I'm talking about the windshield wipers and the fact that there are 3 of them. This car has 1 windshield, 2 seats, 3 windshield wipers. You have 2 on the side by the A-pillar and 1 in the middle. Absolutely ridiculous. You will not see this on any other car. And if you've ever wanted to know how the 3 windshield wipers in the Vector operate, well, here you go. Now next up we move on to the front end in the Vector, and from your angle you can see just how crazy this car looks from the front, how flat and low and wide this particular perspective is. It really is unbelievable to see this on a car, but I will cover the styling in a little bit more depth shortly. What I want to talk about here in the front are 2 other interesting quirks of the Vector, starting with the headlights. Now you can see in this position they are closed. A lot of cars from this era had pop-up headlights, but not the Vector. Instead, you turn on the headlights with that button in the interior, and then the covers pop down. Take a look at that again. You can see that the covers kind of go down into the body of the car, and then the lights are on, and that's how the pop-down headlights work in the Vector. Now, obviously, if you turn the headlights off, the opposite happens. The lights turn off, and then the covers kind of go back up and go back into this position where they're covering the headlights for a more aerodynamic look. Now, another interesting item in the front of the Vector is this panel here, which is unusually flimsy. All right, to open this panel, there's a little lever that you pull in the driver's footwell way down in there, and then it opens to this point. Then there's a little latch you pull here, and then you can kind of open this up. But as you can see, it's oddly flimsy. When I open it, it feels like it could pop off at any second. It's a very unusual thing because obviously this car was designed for high speeds and you would expect everything to be completely stuck down in place, but this panel certainly is not. More flimsy than you would think. Now, up front here you have 2 things. You have a fan, which a lot of exotic cars have for cooling obviously, and you have another storage compartment, which is actually pretty good. Most exotic cars that have a rear storage compartment figure, well, we've gone far enough, and they don't bother trying to integrate one into the front, but Vector did, and this is actually a pretty deep additional storage compartment for extra practicality. Now, once you've put your thing back here, you can close this flimsy panel once again, latch it down in place, and then you're good to go. And one other interesting item worth noting up front, again, lighting related. I already showed you the headlights, but you might be wondering, where exactly are the turn signals, since you clearly can't see them from your angle? The answer is they're under here, the furthest frontmost part of the car, sort of integrated into what I guess would be the bumper. That's where you have the turn signals. You can see with the hazard lights on, probably not the most visible turn signals in the world, but hey, at least it has them. And next up, another interesting Vector item, that would be right here, this label in the driver's door jamb. This is the label that says this vehicle conforms to all applicable federal motor vehicle standards. Basically, the label that says this car is certified for sale to the public. It must have been a crazy celebration at Vector when the government told them they were okay to put this label on this car. It's a pretty big deal. And frankly, I think Vector did a pretty fantastic job with that whole car and jet fighter plane mashup, because for our last quirk and feature of the Vector, we have to talk about its design. And I think this car looks most insane next to a normal car. This is a normal, boring, mid-size luxury crossover, the kind you see in massive numbers on the streets of wherever you live. And this is the Vector. Now, the Vector looks pretty crazy by itself, but when you put it next to a car that is rational, you realize just how crazy this looks. The Lamborghini Countach is a crazy looking car, the Vector clearly is crazier. And here's the thing, it doesn't matter what angle you stage this comparison from, the Vector always looks like it is from a completely different planet. The Countach, the Diablo, they're insane, but they still look like cars. This thing just doesn't. It really is otherworldly, and driving it along, it looks